Hello there, this is Dr. Miller with another episode of Journal Club. Hope you've enjoyed the Journal Clubs thus far. If you haven't, I think we're up to 2021, something like that. Also some book reviews that you can peruse, as well as some educational videos and some videos on like topics and whatnot, which kind of overlap with educational videos. Please like this video, by the way, if you end up liking it, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Again, to get access, well, you have access anyway, but to appreciate, I guess, the video library that's growing. I'm trying to grow as we go along here. Okay, so I have another interesting article this Journal Club, another one related to autoregulation and the reps in reserve model, if you're familiar with that. Reps in reserve are very helpful in non-power movements. So like I wouldn't recommend doing this with like the snatch and clean and jerk, but very helpful in your traditional barbell movements. In this particular case, the studies use front squats and back squats. This RIR is essentially, back up for a second, is an auto-regulatory approach, meaning the individual that's lifting, the lifter, can select the load that is within the bandwidth of the auto-regulation approach, so auto-regulation boundaries. So for example, in the reps in reserve model, you might say do 4 sets of 6, 2 to fail. And so you select a load then that you could do 8 times, but you only do it 6. So 8 would be failure. You leave 2 in the tank, you're 2 from fail. Okay, so you can change that, right? You can go 3 from fail, and this is what the study does: 4 from fail, 3 to fail, 2 to fail, 1 to fail, right? You get closer to failure as you go through a cycle. It takes a little practice to use, but it's helpful. I use this with my remote clients. I work with people who are not athletes mostly, and so in that remote setting. And so after a week or so, there is some trial, again, kind of running up the score. I always, like, special isolation exercises, go to failure, or really darn close for a set, and then you'll kind of know where the boundary is, and then you can start to get the idea of what failure, if you're not familiar with failure, right? Now, I'm assuming the individual can do the exercise correctly. I'm assuming a lot of things when I say that statement. I'm just saying I'm just trying to give context to what this reps in reserve is, okay? So if you're not familiar with it. The study also talks about RPE, which uses a manipulation check, which I'll talk about in a second. Okay, so the study is called Autoregulation by Repetitions in Reserve Leads to Greater Improvements in Strength Over a 12-Week Training Program Than Fixed Loading. I like this study because it was a training study over 12 weeks. It wasn't just an acute study, meaning just within a week or a couple visits trying to compare how many reps they got, etc. This was a training study by Graham and Cleather. If I said that wrong, apologies. And this was published in 2021 in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. If you notice, I talk a lot about ahjsT articles. One, this accumulates good articles, and 2, I have a subscription to them. But I have pulled articles from other places as well if you've been following along in Journal Club. All right, so this was a resistance training study that looked at the outcome measures were front squat, back squat, and there were some other things that were logged along the way, including RPE. And so the study itself was set up as just a straight linear ramp, okay, meaning that week 1 was 65%, and this was blocked. So this is all 3x10 training from week 1 through week 4, 65% all the way up to 72.5%, and then week 2 was 77.5 up to 85%, and then the final 3 weeks of the cycle was 87.5, 90, 92.5, and then 95, which was the max out session. Okay, so you had 2 groups, 31 males. They were strength trained, so their average body mass was 82.5 and 83.5 for the autoregulate, so basically 83.5 or 83 kilos, let's say, for both groups roughly. However, I do want to point out that in general, these individuals are strong. So their back squat was 129 for the fixed load. That's their body weight's 82.5. So you're talking about 1.5, right, strength to body mass ratio, which is great. So they are strength trained. I'd buy that. But this is just one thing I want to mention is that these are randomly assigned, but the front squat average for the fixed loading was 111 plus or minus 19, and the auto-regulated group was 120 plus or minus 26 kilos. The back squat group, when the fixed loading was 129 plus or minus 21, the auto-regulated was 141 plus or minus almost 30 kilos. So even though this is randomly assigned, right, sometimes this happens, is that the auto-regulated group appears to be stronger on average. There's some outliers there with these pretty big standard deviations, okay? So it's just something to keep in mind when we look at the results, is the auto-regulated group may be better trained. They may be strong, well, they are stronger overall, at least based on the means. So just something to keep in mind as we go forward. That means they could be training longer. That could just be that they're stronger in general, and so they're closer as a result of training longer. And so some auto-regulated approach may be better for that type of group because they're, number one, familiar with the loads a little bit more. Again, it's not like the other group was weak. They're 1.5 ratio, so they're strong people. But these individuals may be butting up against, I'll use the term genetic ceiling, more so than the fixed load group. Okay, so just keep that in mind. There's limitations to every study. I think this is a fantastic study. But that's something that kind of jumped out at me. You're talking about a 10 kilo difference in back squat. That's a pretty big difference. 20 pounds, 22. Okay, so just something to keep in mind as we look over the study. All right, so the fixed load group, again, it went through these blocks. The first block was 3x10 training, all the up to 70.5. And then the second block was 4x5, up to 85%, and then a 3x3 at the end. And the way this fleshes out is that, and this is a limitation, but this is also what the study was trying to kind of support, is that the 65%. So, for instance, the first week at 65%, the fixed load group did 10 reps. So they were 4 from fail, hypothetically. So the the individuals in the autoregulated group, the RIR group, were 4 from fail. That's what they're told. Do is get as close to 4 from fail as you can. The fixed load group said do 10 reps regardless. Throughout the whole study, the fixed load group did not have the chance to change the load. Now, this is, to me, a limitation in that if you turn somebody loose in the gym and say, all right, you're going to do 65%, and they'll probably, most people go 1 to fail. Or if they have any sort of, like these individuals, if they know how to train, they'll at least stop before when they lose their technical proficiency. All right. And so what the problem with that is, though, if you do 3 sets of 10, that first set, you'll probably get 14 reps. Let's hypothetically say 15 is the max. And then you find out I'm a little tired. And so you take the load down. And so you lose load over time. Okay. And so in the real world, this is not how this would look for most individuals. If I said do, 3x10 at 65%, right, it probably wouldn't flesh out like they have. Now, this supports, though, 2 things when you look through the study. That one of them is don't go to failure. Even if the fixed load group, we'll see later, they'd had strength gains. So not going to failure is a good thing, especially when a compound movement like this. So that's the first thing is not going to failure is good. Preserving the load is a good thing, especially if you're talking about strength. That's volume builds, volume kills. Well, volume can build strength if it's managed properly because the intensity has to be high enough in order to produce strength gains. We know that. Okay, so in this particular case early on, the idea was to preserve the load that was there. So if you did your 14 reps, and we're tired, had to take the load down the next set, well, now you're losing load. And so, yeah, you have volume, so you might be getting work capacity work done in hypertrophy, but you're not focused. You have the intent focus on strength is what I'm getting at. Okay. So maybe that didn't make sense. Maybe it didn't. I don't know. But the RIR group, again, had this construction. And that first block of 4 where the fixed group was doing 10 reps, okay, from 65% the first week and then moved up to 72.5. So they went up 2.5% every week. The RI group went from 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 and then reset at 4 when the reps per set were dropped to 5. So in other words, the fixed load group was following along the RIRs based on the number of reps that you could get per load, right? At least what the book says, right? So for instance, 80% says you can do 8 reps to max, okay, in a book. Even though that's not, from what I've seen with strength trained people, that's usually not the case. But 80%, 8 reps, the fixed load group were told to do 5, period. Don't adjust the load, do 5 reps, okay? Where the RIR group, again, was at, in that case, was at a -3. So in other words, they were sold 3 reps from fail. So, but they were given the opportunity, unlike the fixed load, to change the load in order to maintain that distance between the amount of reps per set and the perceived amount that should be able to be accomplished at max. So again, I hope that made sense. Is essentially the RIR group is doing what the RIR is intended to do, is allow load changes and stay within the boundaries. Still do 5 reps, but stay within the boundaries to say it's a 3 to fail. So if you I did 5 and it feels like a 4 to fail, add more weight. Now you're at a 3 to fail. I think that was too much weight. That's a 2 to fail. Okay, lower the weight. You need to be 3 to fail. Okay, so that there was the ability to change load. And what was interesting, we look at RPE scores. So how the athletes were, so the individuals were reporting how the session felt. If you look at the fixed load group, which you can't because I'm not going to put this up because it's copyrighted, but a fixed load group, they had an RPE of roughly 6.5 between the 2 lifts on week 1. But as they got to week 2 and 3, the RPE came down. They adapted after that first week. then that fourth week, when they got closer to fail, RPE came up to back to that 6.5, maybe even a little higher to 7. Okay, so you had this kind of up and down, right? And after that first week in the new cycle, or at the end of the cycle, right? They were both in this case. In other words, the closer the fail they were, the harder the RPE was, the higher the RPE was, which is not surprising. Besides the first week, which was just starting a cycle. We all know that first week is a little bit tougher if you've been taking some time off. The RPE kind of followed this kind of wave type of approach, which makes sense. The RIR group, though, had more of a linear increase in RPE because they were allowed to adjust the load. So, starting out around 6.5 RPE, and instead of the fixed group that dropped around 5.5, the RPE group, RPE and the RIR group, I know there's a lot of acronyms here, went up to 7, and then almost up to 8, and then almost up to 9 in that heaviest week as they got 1 to fail. So they were more true 1 to fail than, if you want to equate RPE scores to RIR, than the fixed load group, which was around a 7. They were still around 3 to fail. So the bottom line is the RIR allowed for load adjustments that kept the individuals within the range of the fix, and the range of the reps to failure. And so, not surprising then that there was more load exposure, right, from the RIR group, and therefore they should have gotten stronger. Okay. Again, keep in mind the fixed load group could not change the load. This is not real either. Like, this is not real world either. Like, you would probably change, even if you had 10 reps, and you're like, well, I'm going to go in percentage. I might add a little more weight than probably I should, like, according to the card. So if I go to 67.5, this is the load. I'm like, well, I probably can do a little more than that, right? But they were locked in according to 1RM. 67.5, whatever that load is, they were stuck there. Okay, and so even if they wanted to stay at 10 reps, like in a real gym setting, if I said, okay, next week you're doing 65.5, well, last week I did 65, and it was like super easy. So I'm going to bump it just a little bit. And so what was 67.5, it's probably going to, on the paper should be 70%. It still may be 67.5 because the individual got stronger within the week. This is one of the limitations of fixed load training, is that if you lock yourself in without any sort of autoregulation, then you're either overtraining, and I don't mean that in a term like we always use it, like the load is too high, we're overloading the bar, we're getting crushed, we have to take the load down, it's not as a good session, building up fatigue unnecessarily, or you're always behind to the point where you're not providing enough training stimulus because the individuals, especially newbies, you see this, they're getting strong so fast that fixed loads and percentages don't make any sense, right, based off of max. You should have an autoregulatory approach early on. Even if it's not a formal RIR, it'd still be like, hey, that looked pretty easy if you're a trainer, or you're thinking to yourself, that was pretty darn easy. This is 3x10. I think I can up the load. Let's try, depending on the lift, let's say it's a seated cable row. I'm going to go another brick, right? Whatever the brick is, okay? Or half a brick if you got the little thing you slide on the cable, right? I'm going to add a little bit and give it a run, see how it feels. Yeah, that feels pretty good. I think, right, you're getting stronger. You don't need any sort of, you don't need a PhD to figure that out. Okay. So anyway, so far what we've seen is the RIR does support the idea that the load is going to be higher over time. So instead of being fixed to that or set to that percentage, the individual is given within the bandwidth still of RIR. They're not going to failure. RIR, moving around 4, 3, 2, and then 1, the last part of the block, they're allowed to up the load. And so there's more load exposure during the whole training cycle. So what did this look like in terms of total increase? I'll loads here. So pre-test, I mentioned before, this is the fixed load group, okay? Pre-test front squat 110 or 111, plus or minus. There's a range that was given, so which is good. And then this group went up to 120. I'm just going to report the means. All right. So 111 to 120. Autoregulated 120 to 134. Fixed load back squat 129 to 138. So around 9 kilos. Front squat, for that fixed load group was around 9 kilos. Back squat is roughly the same 9 kilos. Okay. The autoregulated front squat was roughly an increase of 14 kilos, and the autoregulated back squat was an increase around 15 kilos. So the front squat around 9 kilos for the fixed, around 15 kilos for the autoregulated. So allowing for load adjustment is a good thing. That's the bottom line. Allowing for load adjustment during the course of a training cycle, in this case 12 weeks, in a simple ramp is a good thing. Again, the downsides, and again, I like this because it formalizes the loading, the ability to change the load. The thing that you just have to keep in mind was I was trying to probably not get out very successfully is that in a typical gym situation, an individual will probably do some sort of autoregulation anyway, even if it's not reps in reserve. So again, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier, and I'll quickly do this again. If you come in and do 3 sets of 10 at 65%, and the next week you're supposed to be 65.5%, and that's like another 2 kilos, you're like, well, I might just go 5 kilos because last week was so stinking easy, right? That I'm going to go up, and I still may be 3 from fail, but I'm getting strong so fast that I need to make this increase, right? If I stay what I'm supposed to follow on the card, 67.5 with the actual load, I know that I'm way far away from failure. And again, the study highlights that as well. That's the whole point of this study, is to show that you can, the ability to change load is a big deal. It also shows, I hate that word, supports the idea that reps and failure, if you modulate them too, is a successful way to train. So you have kind of both things going on. In other words, using the 2 to fail, 4 to fail, 3 to 4, notation and vernacular allows load adjustment even within the distance away from the repetition max that you're presumed, right? So if I still assume that you're supposed to be 3 from fail, you can still up the load and still be 3 from fail. So again, it's what people usually do in the gym anyway, but it's a way of formalizing it, okay? And it's a way of programming to say, to allow the individual to get closer to failure as well, even if they didn't use percentages. So if I set up a program and just said, look, do 3 sets of 10 with your back squat, 4 to fail, period, right? Okay, and then the next week I said, do 3 sets of 10, 3 to fail. I didn't even put any loads in there, right? If you wrote down what you did last week, you probably have a good idea. You can adjust it up or down. This is, by the way, if you're not familiar with Renaissance periodization, this is how their programs are set up. In fact, you don't have a rep range. Typically, you just do, right? I usually provide rep ranges, but this is how I program. So probably there's a bias alert here too. I do fix loads in some cases, but usually when I see people face to face, like, because then I'll do essentially I'm doing the RIR for them. Okay, this was way too long of a video. I'm really sorry for those. If you made it this far, congratulations. Again, if you like the video, I'll post the link for the study. It is a really interesting study. It's cool to see a training study. They're hard to do with strength-trained people, in this case men, and some really well-done documentation of the loading, and RPE was well done, a good manipulation check. That's very interesting to kind of support the premise of this article, this research study. Check it out if you get the chance. If you can, it's worth your time to give it a read.